It's a great pleasure to welcome Sir Harrison Birtwistle, who's the country's foremost living composer, to Cambridge for these 3 days of concerts, workshops, talk, and so on. And I'd like to start by talking about the All lecture is normally, I think, or more normally given by a musicologist. And sort of, I was thinking that musicology starts at the point where composition finishes. The end product for the composer is the score. And when the score is finished, the composer's business is over. And that's the point at which it becomes possible to study the music. And thinking about this question of the process of composition versus the product, the finished product, which is the score, I wanted to start by asking you about the process of composition, and if you could outline how that works in practice, where the first seed of an idea comes from, and trace it, if possible, given that it might be different from one case to the next, to trace that seed of an idea through to what eventually becomes a finished score.
My goodness. I recently heard a new piece I've written for piano and orchestra, and during the rehearsals of the string section, a few bars of music, which you couldn't hear it was not clear when everything was put together. But I saw something, a sort of seed of an idea there, and I thought, I could do something with this. And so, in a sense, it's a sort of texture, if you like, which I could then, extend or develop, but it's very difficult to know where ideas come from. They come usually from the last piece I've written, and during the process of listening, writing the piece, I'm suddenly in another piece and more interested in what I'm doing than what I'm doing, because when you get to a certain stage in a piece of music, to some extent, you know the point of ending, you know the point of coming to the end of it. Whereas I'm very often asked, do I rewrite anything? But very, very little, not because I think they're perfect objects, because I don't think I've ever written a note that I could find a better one if I really tried. But in the process of doing it, I'm more interested in what the thing is next, what is coming next, and so something like that. And the thing of ideas is, I've often asked students about what is an idea. An idea is something that's very clear until you start sitting down with a piece of paper, which is what I use. They do this now, don't they? It's as if the idea is something. It's like the piece is totally there, like you imagine music. If you think of a piece of music that we all know, and if you say, well, do you know such a piece or such a piece? If you know it, what is it that makes you listen, or what makes you imagining it? Because it's as if the whole of the piece that you know in your imagination, if I say to you, well, anything, even a song, a simple 8-bar phrase or something, it's as if the whole thing exists together like a bundle, and that it's and so that time, the way that time unfolds, is something, one of the problems of music, in that but the thing of hearing, I'm not quite sure what I'm saying now, but well, it's as if the whole piece is there, and yeah.
It's a bit like playing God, isn't it? In the sense that you're creating a musical time, but the time that you take to create that, you might spend 18 months working on a piece that lasts 20 minutes, and you're deciding what happens in that 20 minutes, and there's a tremendous disparity between the time taken to actually compose the piece and then the experiential time of listening to it. Next question.
But this question of ideas, in which as soon as you sit down, it's like a sort of, the idea fades, and the reality of where you make the interpretation of the idea, it's as if something takes over from that, and it becomes something else. It's a bit like that when you imagine a place that you haven't been to, and the idea of it grows in your head in your imagination of the place that you haven't been to. And then when you go to the place that you're going to, that imagination vanishes immediately. It's replaced by the reality of the place that you're then confronted with. And the thing of the idea is that these few measures of string tremolo that I'm talking about, it's as if I know exactly what it was I was going to do, but I'm sure that when you come to hear it, you won't hear those two things.
But it's the moment of hearing it in rehearsal or in the concert when it comes back at you that then sparks something else.
Yeah.
And do you, at that point, do you need to write it down, or do you?
No. No, I don't need to write it down.
Mm-hmm.
But but the other question is, and the idea about continuity in music, because at one time, in my formative years as a composer, which came in some ways slightly later in my life than most, the thing via Europe and that was there were form schemes in which composers wrote. They were like sort of musical architects, and they would write the whole form scheme and then start at one end and fill it in, as it were. And I indulged that way of thinking for a while. I remember having a piece that I put round the wall of where I work, if the piece was 20 feet long, maybe 30 feet long, I can't remember now. It was a lot of wallpaper anyway. And I don't know how I generated it and why, but there was one block and not another block and that sort of thing. But I got about 18 inches down this wall and became bored immediately with the thought that I was going to fill it in. I became bored with it because the context and the reality of what I'd written was more interesting, and the points of departure for the next thing, because of there was a context that I'd found, that the context then suggested so much more than anything that I could pre-compose. I don't know if that makes any sense, but and consequently, I even in the continuity now of a piece about how something is coming, how something comes next, in the way that your imagination looks forward. Even when I finish work, I write notes to myself to how I'm going to continue. And because my memory is not as good as it used to be, I have to write rather intricate descriptions of because it seems that I have to leave it because it's bedtime or whatever, yeah. And so I write these instructions on a board, and usually with a bit of manuscript paper or a shape, I mean anything that can just remind me of where I was before. The following morning, I come down, and so I've lost the interest of what was. What's of interest to me is where I am then, you know, and it's never. Well, it never seems to. I can never really begin from where start again from where I left off, and so. It's as if that the context, it's a bit like you're going for a walk. I mean, in a walk, you either go in a circle and know where you're going to, but in the process of walking down the path, you see things that look quite interesting to your left, which are not in the context of your journey, but, you know, there's a sort of tree over there, or, you know, it's something like that. But composition for me is like a sort of journey, and it's set against the context of what I've done. I used to start everything with the same note, most of my pieces begin with the same note, and it seemed to me to be as good a note as any, because and it was right in the middle of the piano. And it's like a signature, if you like, or it's something. It seemed to be as good as anything else.
If you're writing a huge piece like The Mask of Orpheus, which is between 2 and 3 hours long, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was thinking about something I read in a book about The Mask of Orpheus, that you had some forced interruption at some point, and you.
I what?
That you weren't able to work on it for a certain period of time.
Oh, no, it's not. That's not. I wasn't able to work on it. I said I got quite a long way down the journey of the piece, and it moved from London Weekend Television, where it was going to the original idea, and then it moved to, somewhere else, and then it was going to Europe, and then it ended up at the E&O. But in the intervening years, when they were not, somebody or other kept saying, "We'll do it, but we don't understand it, or it's too expensive, or whatever." So the intervening years, I said I'm not going to finish it until I have production, because it's too complicated, and it's still in that state, really. We got in the first performance, we got about 4 out of 10, if I'm being. Nobody's seen it. Anyway, let's talk about something else.
But what I was thinking about is, if you're writing a very, very big piece on a big canvas and it takes years to write it, what you've just been talking about, that you stop working at the end of the day and then you come back and things change from day to day. How does that work if you're working on a really, really big piece where you have to pursue a certain kind of?
Well, if you're thinking of theatre, where there is a narrative, the narrative is the thing that drives you forward, and consequently, without making comparison, but I mean something like The Ring, for instance, it was that drove. Which drove the music, where the logic comes out of, and this wonderful thing called the leitmotif, whereas there's nothing else in The Ring other than leitmotif. There is no other material. And so consequently, the way that unfolds, our time unfolds in it, is a journey which is very difficult to make if you didn't have the narrative. So the moves within it are things which you don't automatically make as a composer. But I think that there's something in me that is trying to make those moves that's in a narrative, that it doesn't have the cliche of what happens in a lot of modern music, is that it's aping tonality. It goes through the motions of tonality, but it isn't tonal. And I think that there are, it's more interesting for me to find these things. And actually, I like tonality when it doesn't do what it's going to do, and that's something Beethoven was very good at. To my ears, he never does what you think he's going to do.
Do you tend to write a piece from the beginning to the end?
Yes. Yes.
Do you know what the end's going to be before you get there?
They're usually all the same endings, my pieces. No, seriously. But the journey in between is not always the same. Yeah.
There's one case of a piece I remember.
I always feel that that I get into a sort of a mechanical mood, and it starts, whatever it is I've set up starts, as it were, disintegrating. I quite like that. In my piano piece that I've just written, I think it's got quite an interesting journey in the relationship between the soloist and the tutti. That's one thing, because when I started writing it, I didn't know what to write for the piano. I thought, what sort of music? I didn't know what to do. And so the piano is like it's like searching for an identity within the piece, and it offers things up to the orchestra or to the tutti, and sometimes they're thrown out, or it tries to get a dialogue going. And
did it have to be a piano concerto, or did you decide that it was?
No, I was asked to write a piece for the pianist Pierre Laurent. Yeah.
And how did you feel about the business of existing concertos and the classical repertoire and the traditional sorts of relationship between the soloist and the?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have to tell you something we all know, really. Generally speaking, the orchestra plays the tune. I know this is simple-minded, but the orchestra plays the tune, and then the soloist plays the tune. It's a dialogue with the same material, in some respects. Yeah. But how about the fourth concerto of Beethoven? How that begins? We forget how revolutionary something like that can be, because we take it for granted how that is really in the context of the time was an extremely interesting thing to do.
We were talking a little bit about your operas. Could you tell us something about the Oresteia?
Well, that's a long story. I could talk about that and do nothing else. I wrote the music for the Oresteia, for the National Theatre for Peter Hall's production. And we did all three plays. And there were certain conditions set. The conditions were that it was all going to be done with men, and in a chorus of 15 men, and all the female parts will be played by men, which apparently was what happened originally, and in full mask, not half mask. The question of, I don't know, should I get into this? I mean, the full mask is the opposite to the half mask. The full mask is comedy dell'arte. You know, it's physical, whereas the full mask, as soon as you put a full mask on, you become static, and the movement of the body is much more formal and statuesque. So that was the condition. And then there was a translation by Tony Harrison, which was in iambic pentameters. And I had the job of training the chorus. And I set up a condition myself, to make it more difficult for myself. I didn't want anybody that could read music. And that I had to teach them. The rhythm. Iambic pentameters is a deadly thing because it's da 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 da. I mean, whatever. It's in triplets, and then I mean, you people out here know better than I do. What is it when it's divided into? In the beats divided into two? Bum 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 bum. Never mind. Anyway, there are those two things. There's duple and triple, yeah, and it's 5 hours. One thing that I found out very quickly, that what a chorus is, it's not what we think as chorus girls all, putting their legs up together in unison. As soon as you do anything in unison, and particularly in speech, it's incomprehensible. You can't hear it. But even more interesting than that is that if you make the chorus into individual voices, like a crowd, and which allot it to certain people, then it becomes much more. There's like a sort of inner drama within the piece. But so that's what I did, and I came in on the from Twickenham on the train, which lasted half an hour, and I could set enough in my half-hour journey because I had the chorus for 2 hours every morning. I could write enough of just the simple rhythm of the piece, enough to teach it for them that day. And the wonderful thing about actors is that once you've taught them something, they really remember. It's very difficult to change. Having done that, I then taught it to them and gave them rests in very definite rhythm. And so I then had a structure in which whatever I could then put onto that the instrumental part, and all they had to know was that it was 4 beats, 5 beats, change of tempo, which you would do in the thing. So then I had a whole net of rhythm that they had in their heads, and then I could, as it were, set that, and I set that for a lot of instruments that I sort of invented, really, and that was an attempt to try to make a sort of primitive music. I remember going to a very high-class clarinet maker, and I said, I need a raw instrument. And he said, in what key? I said, I don't want any key. I put chalk on my fingers tips and held a tube and just put them down, and then how long? I said, well, one about this long and one about that long, and they were beautiful instruments, but of no acoustically, and
with a normal clarinet mouthpiece.
Yeah, normal clarinet mouthpiece. And I gave them to the two clarinetists. One of them was John Hall, and I said, "Here, learn to play this," and that's how it was done.
Was there any attempt to correct the pitch or to make it into a? Because presumably it was an.
No, I just accepted what it was. Yeah.
But I would have thought for a player it would be very tempting to try and make it sound.
Yeah, but it produced wonderful sort of random harmonics and squeaks, and which were part of the acoustic of the instrument. So on one level it was a primitive instrument, but on the other level it's a very sophisticated instrument. But if I could just come back, you see, to the my piano concerto, my idea of the... incidentally, the main parts came out of the chorus and moved back into the chorus, so anybody could be the nurse or Oresteia. I've forgotten the names of them now. Anyway, but I want to come back to my piano concerto, because that was my way of thinking about the tutti of the orchestra, and I sort of see it that the orchestra in itself, is like a gigantic chorus, and within it, and so I took the obvious levels of the brass, wind, and strings, which is a simplistic way of thinking of the orchestra, and so there's, in a sense, there's an inner drama within the orchestra, and with the solo part.
With the Oresteia, did you started with the chorus and then added the instruments later?
Yeah, I taught them the rhythm, you see, and arbitrarily gave them so many beats. We'll have 7 beats here. So, and then all they had to know that there were 7 beats, and or 10 or whatever. And so then I was free to compose with a lot of improvisation, and within those gaps. Yeah.
Over the next few days, we've got several pieces coming up. We've got the 3 ensemble pieces: Silbury Air, Carmen Arcadiae Mechanicae Perpetuum, and Secret Theatres. And then that's a sort of nucleus, and we've got some more recent pieces and a very few earlier pieces. Could you tell us something about Carmen Arcadiae Mechanicae Perpetuum?
It's a piece that I wrote in Scotland. I used to live in Scotland, and it's a contradiction to what I've been saying, is that it's a highly formalized piece, in which I use a lot of random numbers. I use random numbers in order to, I don't know, to avoid the cliche of my intuition. And it's I don't know, it's very hard to talk about it. It consists of 4 musics, which I made blocks of material of varying lengths, which last something like, I don't know, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, 5 seconds. So there were permutated blocks of material, of musics. I think that was Stockhausen's word, wasn't it? The idea of different musics. So I made all that now, I'm absolutely contradicting myself here, because this is the only piece that I did this. It's a very severe piece in that respect. And it's pieces, it's without any bridge passages. It's like a sort of blocks of material. And then I made another structure, as it were, with the dynamics of the piece. But the dynamics of the piece do not coincide with the blocks of the material. So they're in different lengths. And then I made another layer it's like dry stone walling of the registers of the piece: high, low, middle and high, high and low. And so there's another level of things. So and they're all independent to each other. And then there's the question of intervals. Each music has its own intervals, and the title Carmen Arcadii, it's a sort of contradiction. Yeah, it's how you have it's a mechanical pastoral in perpetual motion. The perpetual moment is that. But the point about my wallpaper in this case, I made too much of it, and then took scissors to it and cut a piece out in the middle. I think I got my youngest son to do it, actually. I said, look, I knew where time was, and I said, I need a piece that lasts about 15 minutes, and you can take it from anywhere along the thing. So he took the scissors, and then I accepted that as I suppose you can call it structure. You can't call it anything else, really, of the piece. And so it's a very extreme piece in that sense. And it was pushing an idea to absolutely a rigorous end that I could possibly construct. But not only that, within the musics, I made various things. Like, I'm very interested in repetition, and actually the repetition of ostinati, but it's not simple ostinato. For one thing, in one of the musics, it has 7 increments, but you never hear all of them. So I drop one out. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is out, 5, 6, and 7, and then in another one 2 is out. So, but the thing is that by repetition and hearing all of them through memory, you think that you're hearing the same thing, but it's always different. And also the layers of these ostinati, and one of them is a monorhythm, in which you get the basic rhythm of which I made, but the other things go with rests go across it. So you get the impression that you're not quite sure what it is you're listening to, how the thing on things. But I just sort of I think of repetition and it's something I've messed about with quite a lot. I'm thinking of an analogy. An analogy of it is that when you look at an oak leaf, all oak leaves are the same, and yet if you compare them, they're all different. Yeah. So there's something that makes them. It makes it an oak leaf. It's not a lime from a lime tree or a beech tree, and so they're all and so my repetitions in that I use it that sort of proliferate my music is to do with that. It's to do with that. And when I wrote Secret Theatre, I used that as the idea is the repetitions are what I call the continuum, which is something, and I divide it in the basic, something which is linear, melodic, and something which is four square, and they are. That's the mechanism of the piece, and it's all composed by this sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I call that the continuum, and the one above, I can't remember what I called it.
The cantus.
Cantus, right. Yeah. So,
I was fascinated by something you said about using random numbers as a sort of antidote to the cliche of intuition.
Yeah.
And that makes me wonder about a sort of defence against getting too attached to your material.
Yeah,
in
but
a way.
yeah, it gives you a distance from it, but it's only local, you know. And if you do it from your intuition, random numbers will provide you with the same image, but it comes up with it brings things up you would never. Your intuition would never. The cliche of your imagination. You make it varied, and things happen in random qualities, which interest me, come up, and they do things which you would never choose.
That's
because if you choose it from your intuition, you always want to make something varied, yeah. And so the order of random quality is of a different order, but but the parameters of it are what you set up in the first place anyway. So it doesn't matter a damn whether it's this or that.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's also something which prevents you from getting sucked into details and spending a vast amount of time on a little patch of something when actually you can concern yourself with the bigger shape of
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly, yeah.
Mm-mm. I'd like to ask you a little bit about when people discuss your music, they often talk about melancholy.
Oh God. Yeah.
And you were talking about Carmen Arcadia with the Perpetuum in the title, and there's another piece called Endless Parade. And it seems to me that in melancholy, one of the things, or when one's depressed, one of the things that makes it so awful is that it seems endless. And there are wonderful moments in the Mask of Orpheus, for example, where it seems as if we're in a thing that's sort of never ending. The sense of time is. I don't know if any of this is making any sense.
Well, I have another metaphor for that. It's that it's like having a car with the engine on, but not, your foot's not on the accelerator. It just stays there. So it's not moving. But it can't be a long note. And but the others, yeah.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll have some questions from the floor. Could you talk a little bit about your fascination with early music? We've got the earliest pieces of yours which are being done in the next few days.
Okay, yeah, I'll have a little go. Sandy will probably remember, or maybe he doesn't, but at Manchester we had a lecture, so-called, in which was history. And each day, each week, they went through the history of music. And when it got to modern music, it got somebody to call out notes, and you got up to 12, and say, well, that's modern music, and then you put it backwards and you put it forward, And that was the end of that. But they had another thing, which was early music, and early music was Bach. And they referred to something called pre-Bach. And I attempted to say, well, you know, there's probably nearly, I don't know how many hundred years before Bach we had music. And but I think that Sandy gave there was a copy of the Ockerchem, not Hockeychem, no, Macho, Hocketus David, which was all right. It was the only piece of old music that was regularly available. And I became, in later years, absolutely fascinated by that piece, because it is like nothing else. And being brought up with classical music, I mean, we're talking about Beethoven and about, you know, his moves and why about it. It doesn't quite do what you think it's going to do, but But at one level, you can understand it in the sense, oh, that's an interesting thing, and there are moments of thinking, well, you know, he made it got a bit darker there and a bit lighter, and you can, in a sense, you can understand what made it what he was hearing, because you can. It's something. Now, with the piece, I was fascinated by the Macho piece because I'm sure musicology can tell me why one note comes after the other, but I don't know what makes it be, what the conditions were to get from one bit to the next. But it all sort of works in a way, and so consequently, the thing of early music. Things happen in it. I don't know what the logic is. That what were the decisions that they thing? I find that I don't want to know what the reasons are. I'm quite sort of interested in hearing it. Just
You talk in the book that you've just done with Fiona Maddox quite a lot about mystery and things being interesting and fascinating when you can't quite work out what's. So I'm going to ask you one.
That's really what in the question of the in the Carmen Arcadia. I mean, I think I like the idea of this superstructure that was, and then hiding it, and as it were, rubbing it out, and then and then it's up to musicologists to come back and find things in it if it's there that you didn't put in.
One last question. Could you say a few words about the conditions for a young composer when you were starting to write and the conditions for a young composer now, and any thoughts or
ask Sandy. I don't know. Well, it didn't exist.
Composition?
Yeah. I mean, we were a sort of part of the Communist Party or something like that, I think. And, And what the conditions are now?
Well, I mean, if you have any words of wisdom for young composers.
I have no words of wisdom. That'd be asking too much words of wisdom.